Today, instead of speaking of the psychoanalysis of religion or the psychoanalysis of spirituality, mysticism, etc., I want to talk about psychoanalysis as a religion. But before we can do that, we have to ask what kind of religion or spirituality or mystical practice or meditative practice we're really talking about. I've argued that it is in the spirit of psychoanalysis to see all human behavior and experience as operating on two distinct levels. For Freud, these are the levels of the primary process on the one hand and secondary process on the other. Primary process being the strange logic or a-logic of dreams and of the unconscious in general, as opposed to secondary process, meaning the logical, rational thinking that we engage in our waking lives, unless to some extent we're psychotic, in which case primary process thinking has invaded our waking lives. So Freud has primary and secondary process, he has unconscious and conscious, he has latent and manifest. Melanie Klein brings in the two positions, the paranoid schizoid position, corresponding or overlapping with Freud's primary process, as opposed to the depressive or reparative position, which has much in common with Freud's secondary process. The move from PS to D involves enhanced reality testing, a decline of magical thinking, the decline of illusions and delusions, and as we move over into D, enhanced realism, enhanced reality testing. In his work on religion, Neville Symington distinguishes between two types of religion or spirituality or mysticism. On the one hand, the primitive, which I would argue corresponds to Freud's primary process and Klein's paranoid schizoid position, and mature religion, mature spirituality, mature mysticism, corresponding roughly to the secondary process, to the depressive or reparative position, mature. Okay, so we have these two categories. We can't speak about religion as such, or mysticism as such, or spirituality as such. We have to specify which type or on which level is what we are addressing operating on PS or D. Okay, I've argued that the same distinction applies to psychoanalysis itself. That psychoanalysis itself can often be carried on, and I'm speaking both by the analysand and the analyst, operating together, primarily or more predominantly in a PS position, as opposed to a psychoanalysis that is operating more in the depressive, reparative position. So, well, what would that look like? Symington certainly tends to associate much ordinary religious practice, that is, the practices that we find in mainstream churches and synagogues and mosques. Much of this is routinized, ritualized, a lot of magical thinking. In other words, much mainstream religious practice is characterized pretty much by paranoid, schizoid processes. If the real goal, as it is for Symington, and as I would say it is for me as well, if the real goal of religion, spirituality, and mysticism is to bring about positive transformations of character or personality, that is, if the real goal of these things is to help a person evolve from a more primitive state of being to a more civilized and advanced state of being, if we're interested in promoting this kind of transformation, the transformation as Freud would have said in 1914, from narcissism on the one hand, which again corresponds with Klein's PS, from narcissism to object love, which corresponds with the depressive reparative position and with Winnicott's capacity for concern. So the primitive position, very narcissistic, magical, omnipotent, ritualistic. The rituals remind us of obsessionality. So there's a good deal of obsessionality in this kind of religion, this primitive type of religion. Whereas in the depressive position, we're describing a character who has transformed his narcissism into a genuine capacity to care for others, not just for himself, but for others. Again, in my own work, I've distinguished between superego and conscience. The kind of morality that reigns in the more primitive PS position we call superego, and it's very much about aggression, turned mostly on the self, whereas when we evolve towards the more mature reparative position, we have what I've distinguished as a conscience that is grounded in the giving and receiving of love and nurturance. Superego versus conscience. So a good deal of psychoanalysis itself operates in this more primitive way. That is, it becomes rather an empty ritual. There's an implicit kind of magical thinking involved in this. Somehow coming and lying down on an analyst's couch 4 or 5 times a week over a period of years is in and of itself supposed to produce a transformation of character. But when the psychoanalytic process becomes routinized and ritualized in this way, it often, in my view, fails to produce genuine character transformation, just as empty, ritualized, routinized religious and spiritual practices and meditative practices and mystical practices fail to produce authentic transformations of character. So psychoanalysis, I think, often fails to produce authentic transformations of character when the kind of psychoanalysis involved is this ritualized, implicitly magical process, which is usually a process that is also highly ideological. It tends to be in some way or another fairly superego driven. Frequently the analyst is an ideologist, has a strict commitment to a particular version of what psychoanalysis is and how it ought to operate, and what within that ideological framework a genuine analytic process looks like. The patient is to a considerable extent drawn into this ideology, or spends a lot of time kind of uselessly fighting it, and not getting on with the genuine goal of the whole process, which ought to be an authentic transformation of character. So just as a lot of conventional religious practice is empty magical ritual, not really leading to much transformation of character, so a good deal of psychoanalysis can fall into this empty, ideology-driven ritual practice without producing much genuine character change. One school of analytic thought, not mainstream, a more marginal school, often tell this joke. Yes, I had a decade-long classical Freudian analysis. I haven't changed a bit, but now I know why I'm the way I am. Okay? A kind of empty learning of why you are the way you are without any kind of fundamental change in the way you are. Maybe in this kind of analysis you acquire a good deal of insight. But it seems that insight in itself doesn't necessarily lead to anything like profound personality change. This is as true in religion as it is in various forms of spirituality and mysticism and meditative practice. One could equally say, yes, I spent a decade in a Zen monastery, but I haven't really fundamentally changed. Okay, if we are after fundamental personality change, call it conversion. I'm happy with that term. I think an authentic psychoanalysis, like authentic religion and spirituality and mysticism and meditative practice, when these things are authentic, they are after authentic personality transformation. One should get over one's narcissism and acquire the capacity to love. Famous statement by Freud in 1914. Unless one develops the capacity to love, one must fall ill. And one must be ill if, due to frustration, one cannot love. Okay, so clearly in 1914, Freud saw the goal of psychoanalysis as helping people fight free of narcissism and acquire the ability to genuinely love the other as other, not just as an image of myself, but as someone who is different and other than me. I should develop the capacity for concern, in the terms of Donald Winnicott. This is fundamental personality transformation. This is what Wilfred Bion would call a transformation in O. O for Bion representing ultimate truth. He sometimes calls it the Godhead, ultimate reality, ultimate truth, and in a Bionian analysis, one is seeking the O of the session, the truth. James Strachey would say the live wire in the session, which we're afraid to touch. But the analyst should be striving to have the courage to touch the live wire in the session, or to recognize and discuss with the patient the O, the truth, in the session. Because for Bion, the psyche needs truth, the way a plant needs water. So, if we're seeking genuine transformations in O, we're seeking much more than insight. I mean, insight means that we change our minds, but not necessarily ourselves or our souls. I can acquire wonderful insight into who I am and how I became the way I am, and just carry on being the way I am. Now, some people might call that a spiritual attainment, the ability to just go on carrying on the self I am, but that all hinges on whether we're talking about a false self or a true self. To just go on carrying on the way I am as a false self is not a particularly inspiring therapeutic goal. A genuine transformation in O would involve me growing out of my false self and making contact with and evolving and growing my true self. And it would involve an increased capacity to be my true self, which is to be true, to become a true person. A lot of psychoanalysis falls way short of this. Often precisely because it has succumbed to ideology. It has succumbed to a particular Freudian, Kleinian, Cohoutian, relational, Lacanian ideological vision of what psychoanalysis is. And very often the ideology takes over and the authentic transformational process is aborted. It doesn't happen. If you look closely, each of the major psychoanalytic paradigms can begin to seem very like paranoid systems. The Freudian vision kind of has a place for everything, and you can strive to put everything in its place. It provides a conceptual system to interpret human experience and behavior. But then so does the Kleinian system. So does the Lacanian and the Cohoutian systems. These all can resemble paranoid systems, closed systems, something which can explain everything, as we know explains nothing. In my 2018 book, I made the case that we need to break out of the silos. The Freudians only talking to the Freudians, the Lacanians only talking to Lacanians. We need to break out of the silos and have cross-silo dialogue. But now I'm speaking about another reason to break out of the silos, precisely to begin to be able to tolerate not knowing. And this toleration of not knowing is not just a matter of having the patient to having the patience to wait until what is confusing and mysterious can finally be absorbed into my paranoid ideological system. No, it's not about waiting to be able to assimilate everything. It's about realizing that my system is incomplete and limited, and there are many things that cannot be assimilated into my system and will never be able to be assimilated into my system because my system is deficient. It's limited. It is insufficiently comprehensive, so there will be things that lie outside it that it can't grasp. But the ideological analyst is convinced that his system is just fine, and it should be able to grasp everything important. I shouldn't have to leave my silo and start listening to the Kleinians in order to begin to understand this thing that my Freudian system can't really deal with. I shouldn't have to leave my Freudian silo and listen to cohesion or relational psychoanalysts in order to understand what's going on with my patient. I should be able to assimilate and account for everything in the terms of my system. Well, that's paranoid thinking. In order to escape such paranoia, we have to be open to looking at reality from multiple points of view, which requires us to give up and mourn the idea that our particular conceptual system is superior to all of the others, renders the others unnecessary. I don't have to open my mind to the other approaches. Ultimately, all of the systems are deficient and incomplete, which is why we need to expose ourselves to all of them, and we need to be able to revise our thinking in the midst of the analytic process. I may exhaust the Freudian, and in order to understand this aspect of my patient's life, I may need to approach it from a Kleinian, or from a cohesion, or from a Lacanian perspective. These perspectives shed light in different ways on different areas of our experience. Okay, that kind of practice is a non-ideological practice of psychoanalysis, and I think much more likely to facilitate genuine transformations in O than a psychoanalysis characterized, conducted from within one particular denomination. And I choose that word advisedly, denomination. We have many denominations within contemporary psychoanalysis, and I think one needs to flexibly move between and among them, and this non-ideological, more playful approach within psychoanalysis is far more likely to promote genuine transformations in O, because it allows a greater likelihood for O to be glimpsed and recognized in its full complexity and wholeness. Of course, I'm not saying that one can ever have a whole and complete and perfect understanding of anything, but one can move towards this without ever finally attaining it. But of course, even in calling for this multi-paradigm approach to practice, I do believe this promotes a more complete understanding. But Bion would immediately say, even the most complete understanding is simply still an understanding. Bion would say one may have a comprehensive and subtle and sophisticated and complex theory of love, but be unable to love. And so when we're talking about transformations in O, we need to go beyond the most complex and complete understanding of ourselves into actually changing ourselves. I think that change is facilitated by a multi-paradigm approach. But the point remains that even the self-understanding emerging from a multi-paradigm approach is simply still an understanding. We're looking for something deeper than understanding. We're looking for the emergence of a different self. We're looking for something like the transformation of the caterpillar into a butterfly. We're looking for conversion. Conversion from the narcissistic, self-centered, anxious, omnipotent, resorting to magic, the self that splits the world into all good and all bad, and the self into all good and all bad, and cannot bear or achieve any kind of ambivalence, a world of part objects, a world in which the other is barely glimpsed as other, let alone cared for as other. We're talking about a conversion from that narcissism towards an orientation towards the other, which sees and accepts his or her otherness and difference, and is capable not only of empathy with the other, but sympathy and caring for the other. A self capable of love. This is the kind of transformation that we're talking about. And of course, this is the very same goal that all of the religions espouse as the goal. This is the goal of any kind of authentic mysticism, any authentic kind of meditative practice, to free us from our narcissism and our obsessionality, our grandiosity, also our depressive self-preoccupation, to liberate us, to be able to enter the field of love and the field of play, unself-conscious play and creativity, and very young children are charming. It's not just that evolution has programmed us to respond with love and care for evolutionary reasons to help these infants be able to survive and pass on their genes, all of that evolutionary psychology stuff. It's they're charming because they represent what we've lost. They represent what we once were. We can't do what they do. That unself-conscious playfulness. And we watch them beginning to lose it, because even the best parenting in the world can't prevent the fall of man. At some point in the second year of life, self-consciousness emerges, the capacity to tell lies emerges, the capacity to pretend, to be pretentious emerges, narcissism emerges. The mirror stage. We watch this happen, but for a time it hasn't yet happened, or it hasn't happened completely, and we can only be a bit awestruck and amazed, astonished by the child's simple capacity to go on being. I think this can be recovered to a considerable extent through a genuine transformation in O, brought about by a deep psychoanalytic process or spiritual, mystical, or religious process. Unfortunately, this goal of authenticity is prevented from achieving success by the many elements of inauthenticity that pervade the primitive religious practices, psychoanalytic practices, mystical and spiritual practices. The inauthenticity that has to do with ideology. I mean, there have been many analysts whose interest in whether what they consider an authentic analytic process has taken place is far more important than whether or not this is of any real help or produces any real change in the patient. Analysts all too frequently think they know what things mean. I mean, it's one thing to form hypotheses about the patient's dreams, slips, symptoms, transferences, but to move beyond the hunch, the hypothesis, into virtually concluding that this means this because that's what your theory holds. That's no longer science in any sense. That's no longer mature psychoanalysis, valid psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis at that point has succumbed into ideology. And unfortunately, in each of the different paradigms of psychoanalytic thought, we see this regression. Unfortunately, it prevents the kind of authentic personality change that our patients are seeking and that we ought to be striving to help them achieve. One example of this regression within psychoanalysis has to do with the idealization of the still face. I did an earlier video on the famous still face experiments in which the experimenter asks the mother, who's been happily facing and playing with her baby, asks her for 2 minutes to put on a still face and turn to one side. And we watch the baby fall apart. Initially, he thinks it's play, and then he gets a little anxious that she's not returning, and then he gets angry, and then he gives up and falls into despair until the 2 minutes are over, and she turns back to him, and then we observe a kind of resurrection as the baby comes back to life. These experiments are fairly well known by the psychoanalytic community, but I don't know of anyone other than me who, having looked at these, immediately recognizes the fact that the mental health community has idealized the still face as the proper presentation of the psychotherapist, who should be not self-revealing. This is the poker face that the psychotherapist, the psychiatrist, the psychologist is trained to put on, along with the idealization of the notion of analytic neutrality and abstinence. We're supposed to remain neutral, which of course is absurd, because the whole analytic enterprise is anything but neutral. We're trying to promote the conscious over the unconscious. We're trying to promote life over death. We're trying to promote love over hate. We're trying to promote truth over lies. These are the ethical values that underlie the whole therapeutic enterprise. But we're supposed to pretend that we're neutral and carry this neutrality into the still face, the poker face. This is a rather astonishing sign of how far the psychotherapeutic professions have gotten lost and failed to comprehend what it is that they're trying to achieve. It's very clear that what these professions, including authentic religion and spirituality, it's clear what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve conversion from evil to good, from narcissistic self-obsession to the capacity to love others, from a preoccupation with death and destruction and nihilism to life and meaning. Our goals are clear. These goals have nothing to do with neutrality. We don't seem to have fully been able to recognize this or admit it to ourselves or to other people.